For the last few months, I've been borrowing my friend Faisal's Ricoh GR III, and I gotta say, I'll be honest, I was pretty skeptical about the GR system as a whole when I first started using it. But to my surprise, over the last couple months, this camera has actually become one of my favorites to take out with me. And I think a part of it is just because of how expressive it feels to use it and just how simplified the process is. With everything I think that's good about this camera, there are some drawbacks to the GR3 that I do want to discuss. And these drawbacks are things that have made it difficult for me to decide whether or not I want to add the GR3 to my own kit. But that's why when Ricoh announced the GR4 and I saw that the rumored specs essentially directly addressed some of the issues or just drawbacks that I saw in the GR3, I got really interested in that camera and I wanted to learn a little bit more about it. One thing led to another, and I ended up invited to this early access, hands-on opportunity to play around with the camera. But we got to feel these cameras out, play around with some of the new features, and just get a sense of what's to come with the 4. Now, to preface this video, I want to be clear that I didn't get to take any images home with me. I didn't get to put any on a computer and play around with the, DNG files to see how they edit. And I also didn't get to leave the room with the camera and go on like a photo walk. Hopefully an opportunity to do something like that happens in the future. But because of these things, I just don't have photographs I can actually share directly from the camera. All I can really speak on is the feel of the camera and just some of the things that I was able to observe in my short time with it. So design and general form factor overall, I think, is the obvious draw for anybody going into the Ricoh GR system. But there is one aspect to this build and design in the 3 that I'd like to see improved in the 4, and that's the build quality. And not necessarily the actual quality, because I do think the 3 is a really well-built camera, but it's more so the feel of that build, if that makes sense. Now, in my opinion, the 3 does feel a little bit plastic to the touch, and some of the buttons feel a little bit finicky, a little loose when you're pressing them. When I picked up the 4, I was immediately stoked on how it felt in my hands. I felt an immediate change or some sort of adjustment in at least some of the materials that they used on this camera. The buttons across the board just feel a lot more firm and tactile, if that makes sense. And the camera itself, just at large, just feels a lot more solid. Now again, I'd attribute this change to some sort of at least minor change in some of the materials used for the build. And to my surprise, they still managed to make the camera a tiny bit slimmer. I think it's technically like 1 millimeter slimmer than the 3. And then in terms of actual layout changes, one of the most notable ones is obviously that they removed the spin wheel on that directional pad on the back of the camera. I know a lot of people complain about that spin wheel. They, hit it by accident when they're out shooting. So far, I haven't actually had that many issues with it. I don't really mind it, but that's gone. Nonetheless, they took it off on the 4. Now, because that spin wheel did have a function for making different, settings adjustments, they did add a new button to the camera on the back. It's a plus or minus button, and it's basically the same switch, the same buttons that they added to the GR2. Now, besides these changes, the majority of the design and the layout pretty much the same on the GR4. And I was really happy about that because I'm just starting to get a feel for the 3. And so if I were to pick up the 4, it would suck to take it out of the box and then feel like I have to restart getting comfortable with it, if that makes sense. Now, as for the lens, you're gonna have a similar 18.3 millimeter, 28 millimeter equivalent lens on this camera as well, but they did reconstruct the lens entirely for the GR4. So it is a new lens that's apparently going to resolve images a little bit sharper around the edges, but I'll wait to speak more on the lens once I actually get to take this thing on some photo walks in the future. Now, a couple other notable changes. The GR3 only had 3-axis IBIS, whereas the new GR4 has 5-axis IBIS. From my understanding, they also updated the processor in the camera. I did notice that the menus and just general UI felt a little bit quicker to navigate through, but they didn't make any major overhauls to the layout of these menus, so everything was still pretty recognizable, which I can appreciate, again, as somebody that's just getting used to the GR system. I mentioned at the beginning of the video with the GR3, there were a couple of drawbacks that have kept me from picking that camera up and adding it to my kit permanently. And the 2 main drawbacks have been the low light, high ISO performance, and the second one is the autofocus performance in those low light scenarios. So I was looking for improvements in the GR4 for those areas right when I picked it up. Now, thankfully, this event was a venue with some pretty big windows, so it had a lot of harsh light that we could play with, but it also had darker areas like hallways, which made it possible to play around with the autofocus, higher ISOs, and do so in a bunch of different lighting scenarios. I was even able to take photos using the 3 and the 4 side by side with the same settings, just to try to get some sense of a comparison while I was there between how the images were looking, at those higher ISOs. And obviously just on those small screens, it's gonna be hard to tell how measurable the improvement really is, but I can attest to seeing a pretty noticeable improvement in just how the files performed at those higher ISOs. On the 3, they start to really fall apart, but on the 4, they looked usable at some pretty high ISOs. When playing around with the cameras, I also found the 4 was just a lot snappier in terms of autofocus. Even in those darker areas, it wasn't really hunting. It was able to find a focal point. And of course, in all the other, scenes around the room that I was pointing it at, it was just a lot snappier than the 3. So definitely an improvement on the autofocus side of things for sure. For a lot of stuff like this, and more particularly for really all things image quality and, sharpness and that sort of stuff, I can talk about what I saw in the presentation and a little bit about what I saw on the back of these camera screens. But of course, those are all things that I need a lot of time with the camera to really get a sense of what those improvements look like. So you can take what I'm saying in this video with a grain of salt, of course, but I can still attest to definitely seeing some improvements across a lot of these areas. And I'm excited to actually get my hands on a unit and be able to bring it around New York or maybe on some trips and really start to see, where those differences are. Now, there's a lot of other changes aside from some of the stuff that we've talked about that they added to this camera, and I don't want to make this video without addressing a couple of them. For example, the new GR4 has 53 gigabytes of internal storage, whereas the GR3 only had 2 gigabytes. They added SN as an option on the mode dial, which essentially takes place for the snap distance priority mode, and selecting that will basically assign the snap focus distance priority point to that front dial, so you can just make fast adjustments on the go. They updated the battery, which is great, extended the battery life to up to 250 shots. And they also added a couple new image control filters, a yellow and a green. Before this event, I was torn between buying a used GR3 or waiting it out and adding a GR4 to my kit permanently. And after this event and seeing some of the improvements that were made to the camera and also the feel of the camera being updated, I'm gonna go with the 4, at least that's the plan right now, assuming they don't sell out before I get one, but I'm definitely planning to place an order, so hopefully I'll get one and be able to make some more videos about that camera on the channel in the future. And yeah, I'm just really excited about it. I'm excited to have one in hand and just hopefully get to take it on some trips and see, what I can make with it. Assuming I get a GR4, I'll obviously do a more in-depth video about that camera, so stay tuned for that. But thank you for watching. I appreciate it. I will see you in the next episode. Cheers.